Alright, we're going to be looking at how we can use the Overflow property to create some interesting effects on our page. We'll be doing this on our Contact Us page, and what I've done on the Contact Us page is I've inserted the fixed Save the Turtle tab that we did on one of the other pages, and that of course will just remain in that fixed position, so when you do your project you'll need to add that in. And if we look at the HTML, you can see that I just have the A tag that wraps around the image tag that contains the Save the Turtle tab, and I've assigned a class of Save tab, which I've styled inside of my CSS. So if we look into our CSS, you can see that here's the Save tab, which is positioned fixed. It's positioned on the right at 0 and the top at 25%. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add some additional content into this section right here. So I'm just going to add a couple paragraphs of text in addition to the contact information. So I'm just going to go into my div with an ID of interior content, and we have the div with a class of contact. That is the div that we've applied a height value to, so that the height of this div will contain that turtle image. And before that div closes, I'm just going to put a couple of additional paragraphs of text. So I'm just using some placeholder lorem ipsum text. If we save the page right now and look at it in our browser, our page looks something like this. So you can see that here's the original text that we had inside this div, which fits so nicely inside the div that has this height value that's specifically applied. But when I apply these additional two paragraphs, you can see that they no longer fit inside the div that has the specified height values. The content actually spills out of the div and it actually goes behind the footer, and that's because this contact div only has a specified height and it's not big enough to hold our text any longer. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the Overflow property to be able to control this. And the Overflow property is going to control what happens to content that breaks outside of its boundaries, or outside of the bounds of the containing element that's it's in. So the default value of Overflow is visible, and that's actually what's happening right here. So here we have a div, it has an explicitly set height value, and now the height exceeds that amount, so the content is going to stick out of the div. This is something that you'll only encounter when you have a containing element that has a specified height value, because normally if there was no specified height value, then the height of this div would just expand based on the content that was there. So you won't always run into this unless you have a specific height value assigned to that containing element. What we're going to do is we're going to go into our CSS, and I already have a rule for contact, so let's just find that. And our rule that we have for contact sets the background image to that turtle image. It sets the width and the height to specified values and sets padding all the way around. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the Overflow property. So I'm going to write Overflow, and the value that we're going to specify here is going to be scroll. And I'll go ahead and save that, and if we go check it out in the browser, when I refresh the page you can see that that content is no longer spilling outside of that div. And if we look right here, our turtle image is in the way, let me zoom out a little bit. If we look right here, you can see that I have a scroll bar on that right hand side, and the scroll bar is going to allow me to scroll the content inside of this div, and you can see how it just scrolls over the background image of the turtle. So that's kind of nice because it is showing or allowing the user to see all of the content. Now when you use scroll, it's going to place scroll bars, or at least the area for the scroll bars, on both the top and the bottom of the box. So even though we don't have to scroll right and left, it puts a placeholder here for the scroll bars. Whenever you set the Overflow to scroll, it's going to give both the horizontal and vertical scroll bars, even if you don't need them. Sometimes this is undesirable, so we can actually alleviate this by using auto. And auto is very similar to scroll, only it actually solves the problems of getting the scroll bars when you don't need them. So if I just go ahead and change this to auto and resave the page, and if we refresh, and actually before we refresh, let me just move that save tab out of the way. So I'm going to go into my save tab right now, and I'm just going to change the top value to maybe be 15% just to move it up in the page a little bit. Now I can zoom back in and I'll at least be able to see the scroll bars. But now you can see that I have the scroll bars and they only show up on the right and the left. I don't get them on the bottom anymore, and they're actually not necessary on the bottom. So this is actually looking pretty good. The only other issue that we have is because my image, when we originally created this image, we had the image so that it had kind of a fade and more neutral colors on the left, and then it went to the full colored version of the image on the right, and that worked well when we just had the contact information. But now that I have paragraph information, you can see that it gets a little bit hard to read this text when it appears on the right hand side of the image. So I'm going to just make one more additional rule to restrict the width of paragraphs when they're inside this contact div. So we'll go back in here and I'll just make a new rule for .contactP, which will style paragraphs that are children of contact, and I'm just going to give them a width value, and I believe if I use about 520 pixels that should take care of it. So if I set that to 520 and I refresh, you can now see that my paragraphs no longer are going over the turtle image, so that looks much better. So this is a handy little trick that you can do if you have content and you don't want it to, maybe you don't have that much vertical space, or you just want to keep it kind of tucked away inside of its own little mini web page or whatnot. You can go ahead and use this overflow property, and it'll actually allow you to have scroll bars that appear right here. So that's really nice. And one other thing I want to show you about overflow is one of the other values that you can use is going to be hidden. Hidden isn't something that we use very often, but it's worth mentioning just so you're familiar with it. If you use hidden, it's going to hide any of the text that extends past the height of this containing element, but there are no scroll bars. So you might think that hidden isn't something that you would ever use, and granted, it's probably not something that you use very often since it does actually hide the content that extends beyond the box, but it can be particularly useful when you're using dynamic content and the possibility of having some overflow might cause serious problems. There are ways to, when you create dynamic content, that you could make the box scrollable in a different manner using JavaScript or something like that. So I just wanted to point that out. That's not something that we want to do here, so we'll just set this back to auto, because that's giving us the solution that we want, where we have the scroll bars, the content is accessible, and the user can see it if they need to. Alright, so that just gives you an overview of how to use Overflow.